between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire in 1676. The Poles and Russians referred to this area as the Wild Field. Locals referred to themselves as on the borderland, or at the end, or in Eastern Slavic languages at the time, Ukraina, which is where the name for the country Ukraine comes today. So the painting is called The Reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks and imagines what it might have looked like in 1676 when the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire demanded an oath of fealty from these Cossacks. Cossacks traditionally were groups of self-governing communities made up of those descended from Russian serfs who fled from their feudal masters. The Tsar allowed them to be free as long as they would be willing to provide cavalry services or military services in the time of war. What most Cossacks quickly learned, though, is that they were on the borderlands of three major empires and they could offer their services to the highest bidder, which they did. So Cossacks fought for the Poles, for the Ottomans, for the Russians, or for themselves, depending on the situation. In the period of this painting, Ottoman forces were worried about their vassals in Crimea. Crimea is part of Russia today. It was somewhat controversial when it became part of Russia in 2014. So they, uh, they wanted to make sure that the Cossacks there would be loyal. So recognizing that the Ottomans really had no power to enforce control over them, uh, these Cossacks were, after all, the army that would enforce that power in Ukraine. They responded with a very formal letter to the Sultan that was structured just like an appropriate political communication to the Ottoman court. But instead of pledging their fealty, they composed a rhyme that was as filthy and profane as they could think of, that included such choice lines as "What the devil kind of knight art thou, and canst not that canst not slay a hedgehog with your naked ass? The devil shits and your army eats." So the reason I started with this picture isn't just so much to, laugh. I want to deal with the Mongol invasions, though I want to do so more from the perspective of one of the areas they affected, Russia, or as it was called then, the Empire of the Rus, or Kiev Rus. So the excerpt that I assigned you for your reading this week comes from a book called Taming the Wild Field. Historically, many Eastern Europeans referred to the vast steppe lands that run from the south of Ukraine all the way to Central Asia as the Wild Field. This was an area that, as Sunderland writes, was familiar to them but not part of them, a nearby foreign land. It was somewhere that was vital to their lives through trade, political, familial relations, and warfare, but also oftentimes feared and ultimately seen as the great unchristian other. What Sunderland shows is that successive generations of Russians came to define themselves in opposition to the field, and taming the field, or the slow process of colonization and expansion, where Russia went from being a forested country to an empire, and still today is the largest country and landmass on Earth. Basically, the field, though, is where Russians worked out their identities. So I give you a really fun introductory excerpt for this week that includes one turning point in Russia's relationship with the field, when massive, unexpected armies of Mongols stormed out of the field, destroyed their cities, and incorporated them into an empire ruled by the Golden Horde, a spin-off of the Mongol Empire, for the next 200 years. Russian historians have long called this the period of the Tatar yoke. Tatars were another steppe people whose kingdom in Crimea would be one that Russians would seize in the early era of Catherine the Great's empire, but a people they long fought against who were also allies with the forces of the Mongolian Golden Horde. Other historians, writing from more pro-Mongolian perspectives, emphasize the power and stability of the empire, and will use terms like Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace, to refer to the almost 2 centuries of Mongol rule over much of Asia, Russia, and the Middle East. So before we get into... Oops, I'm trying to switch slides here. Okay. Before we get into Russia, though, let's briefly review where we've been for the last 2 weeks. I've spent a lot of time discussing the ideas of world systems, especially as a way to understand the trade relations and ideologies that linked and continue to link the world together. I started out by having you read excerpts from 3 different areas of the world that were all tied in some way into the dominant Middle Eastern and Mediterranean trade networks of the period, from late antiquity to the High Middle Ages. Uh, I I don't think I made Janet Abu Lugod's point forcefully enough that in this era, there was absolutely nothing that could have foreshadowed the West's rise to global dominance. But that rise did occur after three major disasters tore apart the archaic global world system that we discussed earlier. So the first of these we discussed last week was the Crusades. Your reading looked at them from an Eastern perspective. In my presentation, I added a good deal on the politics of the dominant areas of Western Europe, especially the Frankish kingdom, uh, the Holy Roman Empire, then France, which would be critical to the First Crusade. I told you the Song of Roland and actually appreciated looking at some of your responses in the bonus question on that. I'm curious to see, the discussion board for this week as well. But I'm recording this on Saturday, and I don't start looking at those until Monday morning. But really showing that it's more of a morality play than I gave it credit for being. So this week, then, we'll deal with the Mongol invasions, and next week, we'll be dealing with the Black Plague. So this map right here, I'll get my face in there too. This map and my face nicely shows the starting point of your reading for this week. It shows Slavic tribes right before several Slavic kingdoms formed. So this is in the area where the Carolingian Empire of the Franks was emerging to the west, you see. Khazars had a large empire in the Don region into the Caucasus. Western Rome in this period was really ruled by Lombards, and Eastern Europe, or the Byzantine Empire, kind of down beyond the map, was trying to negotiate people they considered to be barbarians on all of their borders. And then you also had the sophisticated Islamic empires to the south and east that aren't included on this map. So in this map, though, Slavs are really the empty space in white. Slavs today are a broad ethnic and linguistic group. There are a good number of Slavic countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, ranging from Macedonia, kind of beyond my map here, which was just renamed North Macedonia and Bulgaria in the south, to Poland in the north, to Russia in the east, with lots of Slavic countries in between. Some of the early kingdoms to emerge would be named after tribes, and some still exist today. So in the south, Croats would form the early Croatian kingdom. There, and that's the Hrvati Croats, and there was also an early Serbian kingdom. Shortly after this, the Carinthian kingdom would be absorbed into the Holy Roman Empire, Carantania here. This is called Slovenia today. Moravians and Bohemians would form early kingdoms up here, and they're both part of Czechia today. And many of the kingdoms you see in the west here, like the Sorbians, Polonians, would be absorbed into German-speaking lands eventually. Sorbian, for example, is almost a completely dead minority language in Germany today. And I should point out, too, that lots of these names have meanings. So Poliani, or people of the field, Polonians, would become Poland. In the east, the Didyviani, or the people of the forest. Where are the Didyviani? I thought they were on. Oh, here we are. Didyviani would form the nexus of the Kiev Rus Empire, which would eventually move to Moscow and become Russia, incorporating all of the Slavic groups in this area. So lots of them. And of course, there are non-Slavic groups listed here, like the Ungric speaking languages, like the Finno-Ugric group. So one of the reasons these states all emerged in the 700s and 800s and not before was that Slavs migrated in this period from somewhere in the vast hinterlands of the steppes, this broad region of the world, mostly beyond this little map here, into Europe, seeking better areas to farm and raise their livestock, following on the heels of the Germanic migrations, which came, at the tail end of the Roman Empire. Europe has had some major waves of immigration in its history. Roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years before the Common Era, Indo-European migrations came into Europe, bringing the Greek and Italic languages. And then Small language remnants like Basque, the Etruscan people, and Illyrians tied to modern day Albanians came even before these migrations. But these early Indo European migrations were followed by Celts, who spread across almost the entire continent and were largely incorporated into the eventually Roman Empire. And today, the Celtic languages just exist along the fringe of the British Isles and a little bit of the coast of France. So, across the beginning of the Common Era, Rome experienced the Germanic migrations, sometimes trading with them, working with them, very often fighting them. Germanic speakers concentrated the heaviest in areas of Europe that speak Germanic languages today. So, German, Scandinavian languages, Dutch, and English. Yes, we speak a Germanic language. Then, uh, you know, during the first few centuries of the Common Era, you had Slavic and Finno-Ugric speakers. So Finno-Ugric is Finnish, Hungarian, Estonian, some minor languages spoken in Russia, and the Slavic people. So Slavic people only pushed into Europe between the 5 and 600s. So it took time for them, just like the Germanic people before them, before they established sedentary kingdoms. So this statue right here, I'm going to show you on the next page. Where's the statue? Here we go. Uh, is a statue of the legendary 8th century founders of the city of Kiev, as recorded in the Kiev Chronicle in the 11th century. So there are three brothers here, Ki, for whom Kiev is named, Shech and Horiv, and their sister in the front, Libid. This statue is in Kiev. I lived there as a teenager, and one day my brother and I were hanging out by it when a woman approached us. My brother had actually climbed onto the statue and was sitting on the bow right here, right in front of Libid. And it's in a waterfront park along the Dnipro River in Kiev, and we were all alone, so that's kind of why me as the older brother was letting my little brother goof off. So this lady started walking straight towards us, and I tried to get him down so we could run away, expecting her to give us a whooping or yell at us, but instead she was like, "Boys, let me tell you about your Slavic heritage." And since my brother was still on the boat, we just kind of nodded and pretended that we were Slavs, which we're not at all. But again, you're kind of vulnerable when your brother's stuck on a boat statue. So it turns out that this lady was a history professor. So she told us about how in the 8th century, Varangians, a group of Vikings who were seeking better trade routes with Constantinople, first came into this area and into the forested areas of what is today Russia, which were a rich source of furs, amber, honey, and slaves. Our word for slave actually comes from Slav, as Slavs were a prime source of slaves for the Mediterranean region from the period of the Roman Empire until the Middle Ages, when Africans replaced them. Uh, and sadly, a lot more slaves were drawn from the continent of Africa than from, the vast Slavic hinterlands. But according to legend, as this history professor told us, they set up camp, these three brothers and their sister, in an area with lots of good, clean water, a river that could get them to the Black Sea and on to lucrative trading in Constantinople, and an area with lots of people looking for a leader. The reality was a bit more bloody than the chronicle makes it out to be. The people in Kiev and other tribal leaders would request the rule of Rurik, a Varangian who had built the city of Novgorod. It means new city, and it's ironically one of the oldest cities in Russia. So this kingdom of Kiev Rus prospered and began to incorporate more and more Slavic tribes into it. In 988, the kingdom converted to Christianity and would follow the Patriarchate of Constantinople as their spiritual home. I should show a picture of it here. So the story of sorry. So the story of how that happened is pretty interesting. Vladimir, the king of Kiev Rus, decided that he needed to find a religion for his people. They had a traditional Slavic, pagan religion, as Christians would call it, but in the business world of the late 980s, people didn't want to do business with pagans. Abraham ben Yiju, for example, wouldn't have been able to get a pagan excommunicated for shafting him in business. So with Kiev becoming ever more powerful it was time to find a religion. So Vladimir, according to the legend, first went to the Khazars, down in this area, um, a Jewish kingdom. He liked what he learned about Judaism, thought it would be a good religion, but didn't want the religion of a people who had been exiled from their land and lost their temple. So next he went to the Abbasids and learned about the glories of the Islamic world. He was awestruck and impressed by what he saw. But before he converted, learned that Muslims don't drink alcohol. He apparently had to explain that Russians couldn't live without alcohol, so he passed on that religion, especially vodka. So next he went to Rome and was impressed by St. Peter's Basilica, but found Mass so boring that he fell asleep during it. Russians couldn't have a boring religion. His final destination was Constantinople, Istanbul today. He went inside the glorious cathedral of Hagia Sophia and felt like angels were literally singing to him. Orthodox Christianity, then, would be the religion of the Russian people. So he returned to Russia and in one day baptized the entire city of Kiev, then began to use Christianity as a reason to expand the empire against still pagan Slavs. The story could be completely made up, but even if it is, it really tells you a lot about the early Russian state. Why would they choose the religion of Constantinople? Right on this map, Constantinople is right where my cursor is. Well, making fun of Roman Catholics. Well, Constantinople was their number one trading partner. So why not pick their religion? And the Catholic Swedes and Poles were among their biggest competitors. So, given the early tension after the split between Rome and Constantinople, which happened a few decades after Russians adopted Christianity, it's understandable that the chronicler would mock it. Remember, he's writing in the uh, 1100s. Yet, there was no reason to mock either Judaism or Islam. Neither religion or its people were imagined as threats at that point in time in Russian history. So as the Kiev Rus kingdom expanded, one Yaroslav, called Yaroslav the Wise, would rely less on religion and martial prowess as tools of cohesion, showing the stability that would come with joining his kingdom. His policies instead focused on just the power of being unified into one strong Russian state and his policies of tolerance in particular, even of Muslims and pagans, helped the kingdom to expand until it was gigantic, incorporating much of modern day Ukraine, Belarus, and a large chunk of Western Russia. Uh, these people did not quite quickly convert to Christianity as well. One benefit of being part of Kiev Rus was protection against the slave trade, which flourished in the conflict areas along the edge of the empire, but not inside the empire. So I'll tell you another. Oops, let me move slides, trying to move slides. Okay, I want to tell you another story from Kiev. So growing up, room for my face here. So when we were growing up, we lived in Kiev for a couple years. My brother and I often tried, but never really succeeded at selling stuff in the street. So one day we decided to sell things at the tourist hotspot of Andreevsky Lane right here. And we didn't have permits, so instead of selling, in this busy street area where you have really cool stuff, we sold stuff right here on the right in this big old empty field. And the so as my brother and I were trying to sell a hodgepodge of model airplanes and raw walnuts that we had picked downtown, this old lady came up and started hitting us. She was swearing at us and screaming at what disrespectful little brats we were. And in the middle of her rage, we noticed a small plaque on the ground that mentioned the 800 people who were killed when they were trapped inside the church that was set on fire on these grounds in 1240. Um, really on the exact spot where we were trying to sell our garbage. We felt terrible. It never even occurred to us that there really shouldn't be an empty lot in the middle of a prosperous part of a city of 4 million people. This was prime real estate, had been for 800 years, but for 800 years it's remained empty in remembrance of the people who were murdered when the Mongols attacked Kiev. So the Kiev Rus state was decimated by successive Mongol raids. It would take them centuries to recover and become the major world power they were previously. When the Mongols attacked the Rus, they weren't interested in taking over, just in collecting yearly tribute from the Russians, lest they come again and commit mass murder. So they allowed the nobility to continue to be in charge, provided they pledged their fealty to the Mongols, eventually the Golden Horde. So I want to jump now onto your other reading and give a bit of background on the Mongols. Typically, if I was in an actual classroom, I might show like an excerpt from a Russian Mongolian collaborative movie on the rise of Genghis Khan called Mongol. It's free to watch on YouTube if with subtitles if you're interested. So the Mongols that Genghis Khan was able to unify were a group of steppe people who came from the far end of the wild field. That is the title of your other book. So, as traditional nomads, they, like their ancestors for thousands of years, subsisted by raising and following large herds of livestock. They had developed excellent, strong horses and were superb riders themselves, with innovations like stirrups allowing a skilled warrior to be able to hit a moving target with a bow and arrow while riding top speed on a horse from 200 yards away, or so they said. Mongolian battle strategies involved quick movements of light horsemen. Their political organization was typically clan based, and different clans often fought over scarce resources. This is before Genghis. So, this was especially true during the environmental crises of the 12th and 13th centuries, as more and more people competed for fewer and fewer grazing resources. So, in this period, a person named Temujin rebelled against his brother Jamuka by enticing his soldiers to join him. And Jamuka is his blood brother, not by birth. Temujin initially allowed soldiers who followed him to share equally in the loot they took from raids, gaining a reputation for treating troops fairly. He eventually established a system that was very much like a meritocracy over the traditional Mongol nobility structure. This made him enormously popular. Temujin was troubled by the fact that Mongol and Tatar tribes fought against each other so much and would eventually unite them, taking the title of Great Leader or Genghis Khan for himself. As the Great Khan, he was able to unify the majority of the Mongol tribes, setting up a sort of pyramid type structure where people were loyal to him because they were dependent on the security of the broader horde of soldiers that they were part of. So after Genghis Khan's death, the empire split four ways among the four sons he had with his first wife, Borte. He actually had hundreds of wives and concubines. The main divisions of the empire would eventually be based on these four sons. So you had the Ilkhanate. Um, this map is kind of small. The Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, and then Yuan Dynasty China. So I want to talk about these brief areas now. So what preceded Mongol control of China, the Song dynasty, is often remembered by Chinese historians as a golden age of their history. From 960 until their final defeat in 1279, the Song had a society whose prosperity and relative stability was on par with the great empires of Islam. They had some incredible innovations too, weaponizing gunpowder like never before, establishing paper currency, and coming up with a magnetic, true north pointing compass. Previous Chinese thinkers had come up with a different kind of compass, a south pointing one that always pointed in the same direction using what's essentially a differential gear, though an intricately carved one out of wood. Really cool to see that. Google south pointing compass if you're interested. So throughout the period of the Song dynasty, they had rival Chinese kingdoms of the Jia, Liao, and Jin. Starting in the 1230s, Mongols would first conquer these areas, then turn their attention to the Song. Once he felt that they were defeated, Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, would consider himself the emperor of the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols kept the infrastructure of the Song in place, they just put themselves at the top. The Yuan would create stability on the Silk Roads and allow for famous travelers like Marco Polo and later Ibn Battuta to travel through these vast realms. They also became official sponsors of Buddhism, as its openness was more to their liking than the more insular Confucianism that had dominated in the Song dynasty. Buddhism would later be seen as a foreign influence over China once Mongol rule was over. So on this next slide, I've got a better map of the four entities of the Mongol Empire as they would have appeared by the year 1294. So I want to end with a horrifying story. So in 1258, the forces of another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Hulagu, moved towards Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Caliph himself was oblivious to the threat they posed. He assumed that the Abbasids were still the glorious empire they had always been, and boasted that people from as far away as Morocco and Egypt would come to their defense. They didn't. The Seljuks were the new Islamic powerhouse, and they and the Fatimids in Egypt were far more worried about defending themselves from the Mongols than wasting troops in trying to defend against an attack on Baghdad. Some Christians even joined the Mongols. There were French knights, crusaders, and a number of Georgian Christians from the country of Georgia who helped with that attack. Given the prevalent medieval logic that if a city refused to surrender, once captured, its people deserved no quarter, the bloodbath when inadequately defended Baghdad was seized after a short siege was one of the worst seen in the Middle Ages. The once glorious caliphate seemed doomed. The caliph himself was wrapped in carpets and trampled to death by horses, so he wouldn't have the dignity of having his blood shed into the earth. 200,000 men, women, and children were murdered in 1258. Animals were slaughtered, even pets. One scholar wrote of the destruction that the Tigris River ran. When he wrote about the destruction, he wrote that the Tigris River ran not red with the blood of victims, but black with the ink of scholars, as the Mongols destroyed the massive libraries of the city. Others lamented the blood. Baghdad would become a wasteland, in part due to exorbitant Mongol taxes. The memory of this destruction lives on. Osama bin Laden, certainly not a representative of actual Islam, but someone familiar with its culture, would lament when the U.S. attacked Baghdad in 2003 that their attack was worse than that of Hulagu Khan. And everyone knew what he was talking about when he said that. So I should point out too that not all Mongols approved of this attack. Hulagu, leader of the Ilkhanate, would find himself immediately in a civil war with the Chagatai and Golden Horde after this attack. They both had embraced Islam as official religions of their empires, and they were horrified that fellow Mongols could have done this. The Ilkhanate would later become Islamic as well. Mongols in general were tolerant and open to religious difference. Tolerance is always cool. Mass murder, which they were also into, not so much. Okay, so to review, the Mongols destroyed three of the great empires of what we've been terming in this class the Archaic Globalization period. They destroyed the Kiev Rus, they destroyed Song Dynasty China, and they destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. They also created the largest empire in history ever, as far as landmass, either before or since. Their light administration from the top, with an emphasis on security, allowed for trade to reemerge and prosper. Was it worth the destruction? Well, the Mongols wouldn't outlast the next great disaster that we'll be talking about, the Black Plague. So, as always, reach out to me if anything seems unclear. And, I hope that, again, that this presentation is a supplement to your readings, that this and really engaging with the focus questions helps you to critically think about the way histories are written of these periods. So talk to me, try your hand at these bonus questions, and have an amazing week 3.